The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the border of what was once the United States of America. Now, it was a desolate wasteland, divided by a line of defense that stretched across what remained of the southern edge. Here, at the border, the undead had begun to gather, an ever-growing horde that relentlessly sought to cross into the last vestiges of human-controlled land. The area was a no-man's land, with only a few hardened soldiers and survivors keeping watch. Captain Tommy Herrera stood at the edge of the fortified outpost, his eyes scanning the horizon. The metal gates of the border fortifications were reinforced with barbed wire, and guard towers loomed above, manned by weary soldiers. The world outside had descended into chaos, but the border remained the last line of defense. Behind him, the crumbling remnants of the once thriving city of San Antonio lay in ruins, overrun by the undead, as well as pockets of hostile human groups. The border was all that separated civilization from the nightmare that lay beyond. "How long do you think we can hold this place, Captain?" asked Sergeant Rachel Parks, a no-nonsense soldier with a sharp gaze and a deep knowledge of tactics. Her voice broke through the silence, and Tommy turned to face her. He could see the worry etched on her face. They all knew what was coming. "Not long," Tommy replied grimly. "They're getting smarter. They're organizing. We've seen them moving in waves, coordinating like they know what they're doing." The undead had always been a terrifying force, driven only by their insatiable hunger for human flesh. But recently, something had changed. The hordes no longer just wandered aimlessly. They moved in formation, as though they were aware of the weak points in human defenses. They were evolving, and that made them more dangerous than ever. As Tommy paced the edge of the wall, his mind raced through the information they had gathered. It had been weeks since they first noticed the change in the zombie behavior. A surge in coordinated attacks had begun, and now the military was pulling all its resources to try and contain the threat at the border. They couldn't afford to lose this position, not with the rest of the country in chaos. Behind the gates, the survivors who had taken refuge at the border base had been growing restless. People were scared, not only of the undead but of each other. Trust had become a rare commodity. It wasn't just the zombies they had to worry about anymore, it was the people who had lost their humanity, turning desperate and violent in the face of annihilation. The border had become a refuge, but it was also a pressure cooker, ready to explode. "Hey, Captain! We've got movement," yelled one of the lookouts from a nearby tower, interrupting Tommy's thoughts. He snapped his attention to the east, where the lookout was pointing. A small group of figures had emerged from the smoke-filled horizon. Tommy's heart sank as he recognized the familiar shuffle of the undead. "Here they come," Rachel muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her rifle. The base sprang into action. Soldiers rushed to their posts, preparing for the inevitable assault. But Tommy knew this wasn't just any ordinary attack. The way the zombies were moving, it was different. There was a deliberate pace to their advance, a rhythm to it. "Prepare the defenses. Double the patrols on the west wall," Tommy ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil bubbling inside him. "No one gets through this line." The sound of clanging metal echoed as the gates were reinforced, and watchmen climbed into the guard towers. Every soldier knew what was at stake. They had all witnessed the destruction the undead had caused in nearby towns, where entire communities had been wiped out in mere hours. The border was their last hope. As night began to fall, a chill crept over the camp, and Tommy stood at the edge, his eyes never leaving the advancing horde. He couldn't shake the feeling that something worse than just another attack was coming. The zombies were closing in, but they were not the only threat. The last remnants of humanity were just as dangerous. Just as he turned to walk back toward the command center, a loud, ear-splitting shriek pierced the air. Tommy's head snapped around, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The zombies had stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence, and then they surged forward, faster than they had ever moved before. "Move out!" Tommy shouted. "Brace for impact!" The soldiers scrambled into position, their hands trembling as they readied their weapons. As the horde approached, it became clear that this would not be just another wave. This time, it was personal. The first wave hit with overwhelming force, the undead crashing into the barricades. Screams filled the air as the battle for survival at the border began. Tommy gritted his teeth and gripped his rifle tightly, ready to face the oncoming nightmare. The edge of dead America was about to be tested like never before. Would you like to continue with Part 2? The Horde's assault was relentless, a tidal wave of decaying flesh crashing against the fortified walls of the border outpost. Tommy's heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. He had seen the way the zombies moved, coordinated, and now it was more apparent than ever, something had changed within the undead. Open fire! Tommy barked, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of approaching footsteps and the metallic clatter of weapons. The soldiers stationed in the towers unleashed a barrage of gunfire, their bullets striking the front lines of the zombie mass. But the undead kept coming, seemingly unfazed by the gunfire, their empty eyes locked on the living. The first wave of zombies crashed against the wire fences with a sickening thud. The wire shook violently, but it held for the moment. There was no time for celebration. As more zombies piled up behind them, the first fell, tripping and tumbling over their decaying bodies. It was a cruel reminder that even in death, they didn't stop. Tommy's grip on his rifle tightened. He sprinted toward the nearest barricade, pulling his team into position. "We hold them here, at all costs," he ordered. Rachel, always by his side, nodded grimly as she positioned herself with a heavy machine gun. The wall of undead grew thicker as more zombies surged forward. Some dragged themselves on broken limbs, while others walked, almost ran, completely unimpeded by their injuries. As they neared the gates, the soldiers could hear their groans and moans, a haunting chorus of death that filled the air, mixing with the rapid-fire sound of gunshots. It was as if the entire world was locked in an eerie symphony of destruction. "Shit," one soldier cried out. His hand shook as he aimed, narrowly missing a zombie that had come too close. It was then that Tommy saw something he hadn't noticed before: zombies with missing limbs were moving faster, as if their movement had been honed by necessity. There was no doubt in his mind now, something more intelligent, more calculating was driving them forward. "Focus. Don't let them break through," Tommy yelled, his voice cutting through the panic. The air was thick with dust and smoke as grenades exploded along the perimeter. The ground shook under their power, sending tremors through the barricades. Tommy caught sight of a zombie that had somehow managed to climb over a section of the wall, its rotting hand gripping the top like a grotesque climber. One of the guards was too slow to react, and the creature lunged, its teeth snapping dangerously close. A shot rang out, then another. The zombie's head exploded, but not before it had caused a moment of terror. More zombies began to scramble over the fences, their rotting limbs barely able to hold them up. The soldiers on the ground were quick to retaliate, firing their rifles, while others moved quickly to set up explosive devices at key points. But the zombies were everywhere now, pouring into the base like a flood. Rachel opened fire with the heavy machine gun, mowing down row after row of zombies, but for each one that fell, two more took its place. The undead had no fear, no hesitation, just an overwhelming need to reach the living. "Captain," Rachel called, her voice filled with urgency. "They're getting through the west wall. We need backup." Tommy didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the west side of the compound, where the undead had managed to breach a section of the wall. The soldiers who had been stationed there were now frantically fighting to hold their ground, but it was clear that they were losing. The zombies were entering in waves, their movements growing faster and more coordinated with each passing minute. Tommy reached the wall and raised his rifle, immediately targeting a group of zombies tearing through the gap. One by one, they fell. But the sheer number of them was overwhelming. As he fired, he could see the look of fear in the eyes of the survivors, those who had been guarding the border before the attack. They weren't trained soldiers, they were ordinary people, forced into a life they never imagined. "Form a line," Tommy shouted. "Get those reinforcements here now." Rachel appeared beside him, breathless but determined. "We can't keep fighting like this. If we don't get those gates shut down, we'll be overrun." Tommy took a deep breath. There was no time to think of a better plan. He was a soldier, and he had to fight for the survivors who were depending on him. "Make sure we don't lose that west wall," he ordered, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "I'm going to get the gates secured. We hold this place." With determination, Tommy moved toward the gates, where several soldiers were trying desperately to close them. But the zombies were closing in, more determined than ever to break through. Tommy reached the control panel, his fingers flying across the buttons. Sweat dripped down his face as he fought against the mechanical failure that seemed to be making everything harder. Every second felt like an eternity. Behind him, the sound of zombies crashing into the perimeter made his stomach churn. "Come on, come on," Tommy muttered under his breath as he tried to override the system. Finally, after what seemed like an age, the gates began to close. But not fast enough. He turned around just in time to see a large group of zombies bursting through the gap. It was a race against time now. Would they make it? Would they survive the night? The battle for the border had only just begun. Would you like to continue with Part 3? The clang of metal and the roar of gunfire filled the air as Tommy and his team fought with everything they had. The gates had begun to close, but the zombies were pushing through the narrow opening with relentless force. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he raced back toward the west side of the base, where the sounds of the ongoing battle were growing louder. His mind was a blur of calculations and plans, but none of it seemed to matter. All that mattered was surviving the night. "Fall back to the inner perimeter," Tommy shouted over the noise, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "We're not going to stop them here. We need to regroup." The soldiers around him hesitated for a split second, but Rachel quickly took charge. "You heard the captain. Fall back. Now," she barked, her commanding tone cutting through the panic. Tommy glanced back at the gates, where the last of the zombies were trickling through. The metal doors were closing, but the damage was done. The undead had infiltrated the outer wall, and now they were inside the base. They were swarming in every direction, their grotesque forms crashing into soldiers and civilians alike. "To the inner compound, move," Tommy urged, his mind racing with options. He could see soldiers setting up defensive lines around the inner compound, but the number of zombies was quickly overwhelming them. The more the survivors fought back, the more the undead seemed to multiply. It was as though there was no end to the horde. As Tommy pushed forward, he noticed the survivors, families, children, the elderly, fighting alongside the soldiers. It was a desperate struggle, but everyone was determined to hold on. The people who had taken refuge here, hoping for safety, were now becoming soldiers in their own right. They knew that there was no hope of escape. If they didn't fight, they would die. "Get to the barricades," Rachel called, her voice crackling over the radio. "We need to make a stand, or we're all done for." Tommy nodded, directing a group of survivors to reinforce the barricades with whatever they could find. Every minute counted now. The inner compound was the last bastion of hope, but it wouldn't hold if the zombies kept coming at this pace. He could hear the distant rumblings of more undead closing in on the base from the other side of the border, and he knew the worst was yet to come. "Captain!" One of the soldiers shouted from the tower, a look of sheer panic on his face. "There's more. Hundreds, maybe thousands, coming from the east." Tommy's eyes narrowed. The zombies had breached the wall, but there was no way they could face a full-on assault from multiple directions. They were being surrounded. "We need more ammunition," Tommy barked, spinning on his heels. "Everyone, get to the ammo crates and reload. We're going to need everything we've got." The soldiers scrambled to get more ammo, their hands shaking as they loaded magazines and checked their weapons. Tommy reached for his rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands as he prepared for the oncoming storm. The zombies were closing in from every side, and soon they would be face to face with the most terrifying force of nature known to man, the undead. As the last of the survivors reinforced the inner compound, Tommy quickly devised a strategy to hold them off. They would need to fortify the last remaining barricades and make use of whatever they had, everything from barbed wire to explosive traps. The situation was dire, but Tommy was a soldier. He knew how to adapt, how to fight with nothing but the clothes on his back and the will to survive. The zombies were now at the gates of the inner compound, their eyes fixated on the survivors. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers readied their weapons. The moment of truth was upon them. The first wave of zombies reached the barricades, and chaos erupted. Tommy's rifle fired with deadly precision, each shot a testament to his training and experience. But no matter how many they took down, more zombies kept coming, pouring in from all sides like a flood of death. Rachel fired the heavy machine gun, the gun's deafening roar cutting through the chaos. Her aim was perfect, mowing down the first few rows of zombies, but for every one that fell, 2 more replaced it. The zombies' relentless numbers made it clear that they weren't going to stop until they had consumed everything in their path. "We can't keep this up," one of the soldiers yelled, his voice laced with desperation. "There's too many of them." Tommy didn't respond. His mind was focused on the task at hand, survival. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. If they were going to make it through the night, they needed to hold strong. They had to keep fighting. There was no other option. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the rear of the compound. Tommy spun around, his rifle raised, only to see a group of zombies tearing through a section of the barricade. The last defense line was crumbling. "Fall back to the final holdout," Tommy shouted, fear creeping into his voice for the first time that night. "Everyone, move now." The survivors began to retreat toward the last remaining stronghold within the compound, a reinforced building that had once served as a storage facility but now would become their sanctuary. But the zombies were close behind, their guttural growls filling the air as they closed in. Tommy and Rachel led the charge, pushing survivors through the door of the storage facility. Just as the last soldier made it inside, Tommy slammed the door shut and threw the lock into place. Outside, the zombies were pressing against the building, but for the moment, the survivors were safe. The walls groaned under the weight of the undead, but they held. Inside, everyone was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the soldiers and the occasional sob from the civilians. Tommy leaned against the door, sweat dripping down his face. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Would you like to continue with part 4? Inside the storage facility, the survivors gathered in tense silence. The Horde had been relentless, but for now, they were safe behind the fortified walls of their temporary sanctuary. Tommy wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, far from it. It had only just begun. "Everyone, stay calm," Tommy ordered, his voice steady despite the panic that clawed at the edges of his mind. "We've got time to regroup, but we need to stay focused. They won't stop. Neither can we." The survivors looked around at each other, exhaustion evident in their eyes. The soldiers were no better off, their uniforms stained with dirt and sweat, their faces drawn with the strain of the fight. Rachel stood beside Tommy, her eyes scanning the room, checking every face for signs of fear. There was no room for fear now, not if they were going to survive. "How long do you think we have before they find another way in?" Rachel asked quietly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of the question. Tommy ran a hand through his hair, thinking quickly. "The outer perimeter is compromised. They'll be looking for weak points to exploit. But with the gates closed, the main entry should hold for a while. We need to use that time wisely. Rest, reload, and prepare for the worst." Rachel nodded. And if they do find another way in? We fight, Tommy said firmly. We hold them off long enough for the rest of us to make a run for it. But we're not just surviving here, we're holding the line. If they break through this facility, we lose everything. The survivors were quiet, but Tommy could see the resolve in their eyes. They had been through hell already, and now they were about to face more. But there was no turning back. As the minutes passed, the reality of their situation began to settle in. The air in the storage facility was thick with tension, a palpable sense of uncertainty hanging over the group. The sound of the zombies pressing against the walls of the compound was muffled, but it was always there, a constant reminder that they were trapped. Tommy moved to a corner of the room, where a small group of soldiers were huddled around a map, plotting their next move. He crouched down beside them, his eyes scanning the hastily drawn layout of the border base. The map was old and outdated, but it was all they had. We need to reinforce our position, Tommy said, pointing to the area around the storage facility. These walls won't hold forever, especially if the zombies start getting smarter. We can't just sit here and wait for them to break in. We need to take the fight to them. Rachel joined him, studying the map with a critical eye. If we take the fight to them, we risk losing any chance of escape. We're surrounded, and we don't have enough ammo to sustain a prolonged fight. Tommy didn't like the thought of sitting idly by, waiting for the inevitable. But Rachel was right. They were running low on supplies, and they didn't have the manpower to launch an offensive. Their best bet was to fortify their position and wait for reinforcements. If that was even a possibility. Any word on reinforcements? Tommy asked, looking at one of the soldiers who had been monitoring the radio. The soldier shook his head, his face grim. Nothing. The communication lines are down. We're on our own out here. A chill ran down Tommy's spine. They had no backup. No help was coming. It was just them, the zombies, and the ticking clock. We'll make do, Tommy said, trying to keep his voice calm. We still have time. We'll hold out as long as we can. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder. And if that time runs out? Tommy didn't answer right away. The question hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken fear that lingered between them. If they couldn't hold their ground, they would have no choice but to escape, through the horde, or over the wall. It wasn't an option he wanted to consider, but the longer they stayed, the more likely it became. As Tommy stood up, he surveyed the room. The survivors were scattered throughout, trying to rest, clean their weapons, or comfort each other. It was a fragile peace, and Tommy knew it wouldn't last long. Every minute that passed was another minute the zombies were out there, organizing, adapting, and getting closer. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by a low, guttural growl. The ground beneath their feet shook as a horde of zombies slammed into the outer wall. The sound was deafening, and Tommy's heart leapt in his chest. They were here. They had found another weak spot. Get ready! Tommy shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. They've found a breach. Move to your positions. The survivors scrambled to their feet, weapons in hand. The soldiers rushed to the windows, peering outside to assess the situation. Tommy grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber, making sure it was fully loaded. He glanced at Rachel, who was already at the door, ready to lead the charge. We hold them off here, no matter what, Tommy said, his voice low but filled with determination. Rachel nodded. We fight until the last man stands. Tommy took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no more time for planning, no more time for hesitation. The battle was about to reach its peak, and there was no turning back. They had one last chance to survive. The first zombie appeared at the breach, staggering forward with its twisted gait. Then more followed, their faces twisted in grotesque snarls, eyes empty yet filled with a hunger that could never be satisfied. They were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had consumed everything in their path. Open fire. Tommy barked, and the room erupted into chaos. Would you like to continue with Part 5? The deafening sound of gunfire echoed throughout the storage facility, as the survivors and soldiers fought tooth and nail to keep the zombies at bay. Tommy's heart raced as he watched the first wave of the undead crash against the barricade. The walls trembled under the impact, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The survivors had trained for moments like this, but even so, it was hard to shake the feeling of overwhelming dread. The zombies were relentless, their grotesque forms clawing at the walls, pushing, shoving, and howling as they fought to get through. Tommy had seen the horrors of the outbreak up close, but nothing compared to the sheer terror of facing the undead at your doorstep, knowing that every minute brought them closer to the final breach. Keep firing. Tommy shouted, his voice steady but filled with urgency. He snapped off another shot, taking down one of the zombies at the front of the group. Don't let up. Rachel was by his side, her machine gun barking death as she mowed down zombie after zombie. The survivors had created makeshift barricades from whatever they could find, crates, furniture, and even old vehicles, but it wouldn't take long before the zombies figured out how to break through. They had to hold as long as possible, or they'd be overrun. Captain, one of the soldiers shouted, his face pale as he looked through a gap in the barricade. There's too many of them. We can't stop them all. Tommy's eyes darted toward the breach. More and more zombies were pouring through, their hollow eyes glowing in the dim light. There was no stopping the tide, they were being slowly consumed by it. Yet, there was a glimmer of hope in Tommy's chest, a small, burning ember that refused to die. He refused to give in. Hold your ground. Tommy yelled, trying to rally the troops. We can do this. We fight together, and we survive. But as the words left his mouth, he could feel the situation slipping from his grasp. The zombies weren't just attacking, they were adapting. They weren't just mindless creatures, they were learning. The first few zombies had been easy to take down, but now, as they pressed forward, they were coordinating their movements. They were moving in unison, pushing in ways that made it harder to keep them at bay. Rachel turned to Tommy, her eyes wide with realization. They're evolving. They're getting smarter. Tommy's stomach churned. It was what they had feared all along. If the zombies were evolving, there was no telling what they would be capable of next. They couldn't afford to wait around and find out. We need to fall back to the secondary holdout. Tommy shouted. Now! Get everyone moving. The survivors hesitated, some looking toward the door, others frozen with fear. But Tommy's voice cut through the fear, and slowly, they began to move. Rachel's machine gun roared again, providing cover fire as the others scrambled toward the exit. But the zombies were pressing harder now, their claws scraping against the walls, trying to claw their way in. Move! 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 Rachel barked, urging everyone to move faster. Tommy grabbed one of the survivors, a young woman with wide eyes, and pulled her along with him. Stay close, he ordered, glancing over his shoulder to see the zombies closing in. We don't have much time. The survivors poured through the exit and into a narrow hallway, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be enough. The zombies were too many, and they were getting closer by the second. We can't outrun them forever, one of the soldiers said, breathing heavily. We need to make a stand. Tommy looked at the group, the weight of their situation bearing down on him. There were only a handful of them left, and they were all exhausted. The last thing they needed was to get cornered. But he couldn't just abandon them either. He couldn't leave them to face the undead on their own. We'll hold them here, Tommy said, his voice firm. Everyone, form a line. Keep your back to the walls and watch your flanks. The survivors and soldiers quickly fell into formation, taking cover behind crates and debris. The walls of the secondary holdout were made of reinforced steel, but it wouldn't take long for the zombies to figure out how to breach it. Tommy could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as the first wave of zombies reached the entrance. Here they come. Rachel shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Get ready. The first zombie slammed against the door with a sickening thud, its body crumpling from the impact. But others were right behind it. They had already started to tear into the walls, their ragged claws and teeth finding purchase in the weakest spots. Tommy's rifle fired again and again, each shot dropping a zombie before it could reach them. But it wasn't enough. The door was starting to splinter, and the sound of the undead pouring through was deafening. Tommy's mind raced. They couldn't keep fighting like this, not with limited ammo and no reinforcements. There was no way they could hold this position for long. Rachel, take the survivors to the next room, Tommy ordered, his voice calm but firm. Get them to safety. I'll hold the door. Rachel hesitated for a moment, looking at him as though she wanted to argue. But she knew what needed to be done. Be careful, Captain, she said quietly, her voice strained. Tommy nodded. I'll be fine. Go. As Rachel ushered the survivors into the next room, Tommy stayed behind, taking his place at the front of the barricade. He slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle and took aim. The door was nearly gone now, and the zombies were pushing through in full force. They would be in any second. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he fired, each shot a desperate attempt to keep the flood at bay. The weight of the world seemed to crash down on him, but he refused to give in. He couldn't. Not now. Not when so many lives depended on him. And as the door finally splintered and gave way, Tommy stood his ground, his rifle raised, ready to face whatever came next. Would you like to continue with part 6? The door splintered with a thunderous crash, and the zombies poured into the room like a flood breaking through a dam. The survivors were barely through the hallway when Tommy's last line of defense collapsed. In a blur of motion, he fired shot after shot, taking down the first wave of zombies with precision. Each bullet felt like a lifeline, each kill a small victory against the growing storm. But the zombies weren't just mindless creatures anymore, they were smarter, faster, more relentless. They surged forward, pressing against the survivors' dwindling defenses. The first few shots were successful, but for each one that fell, 2 more took its place. The battle was becoming a game of numbers, one that Tommy and his team were losing. Rachel had already ushered the survivors into the next room, and Tommy could see them huddling in the corner through a crack in the door. He could feel their eyes on him, a silent plea for help, but there was nothing more he could do. The tide was turning, and it was only a matter of time before they would be overrun. Stay strong, Tommy muttered under his breath, as if the words could somehow summon the strength they all needed. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. Tommy's muscles burned from the constant firing, but he refused to slow down. He would not give up, not when they had come so far. A loud bang sounded as a zombie crashed into one of the windows, its clawed hands scraping against the glass. The room was now a cacophony of screeching undead and the rapid-fire crack of guns. Tommy ducked as another zombie lunged at him, narrowly missing with its decaying hands. His instincts kicked in, and he fired point-blank, dropping the monster in a spray of blood. But there were too many. For every zombie that fell, 2 more rose to take its place. The walls of the secondary holdout were no longer an effective barrier. The zombies were breaching their positions faster than Tommy could anticipate. Panic began to creep into the survivors' faces. They were running out of time, and they were running out of ammo. Tommy. Rachel's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. She was standing in the hallway, motioning for him to fall back. We need to move, now. Tommy looked at her, his eyes filled with grim determination. We can't just leave them. Not after everything we've fought for. We don't have a choice. Rachel snapped, her voice filled with urgency. You've held this position long enough. We need to get the survivors to safety. Tommy hesitated for a moment, weighing the decision in his mind. His team was exhausted, and they couldn't keep this up forever. He knew she was right. They needed to retreat, regroup, and fight another day. But the thought of leaving behind the survivors they had fought so hard to protect felt like betrayal. "Go!" Rachel shouted, seeing the hesitation in his eyes. "We'll cover you." Tommy took a deep breath and nodded. He knew what needed to be done. He motioned to the survivors to follow him, but not before giving one last look at the door as it groaned under the weight of the zombies' assault. The next wave would be coming through any second. "Move out!" Tommy barked, taking the lead. He knew that time was against them, and the survivors could not afford to waste another second. They sprinted through the hallway, the sound of gunfire and the relentless groaning of the undead following them every step of the way. The next room was up ahead, their last line of defense. It had no windows, only one door, and was reinforced with steel shutters. It was their only hope of surviving long enough to regroup and plan the next phase of the escape. The survivors filed into the room, and Tommy slammed the door behind them, locking it with a resounding clang. For a brief moment, everything went quiet. The oppressive sounds of the outside world, the constant roar of the undead and the creaking of walls, faded, replaced by the ragged breaths of the survivors. "Is everyone here?" Tommy asked, his voice calm but heavy with worry. He quickly scanned the group. Rachel nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We're all here, but not for long. The zombies will be at that door in minutes. We can't stay here." Tommy stepped forward, looking around at the survivors. His eyes landed on a young man, barely 18, who had been shaking with fear ever since they entered the facility. "You okay?" Tommy asked. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know how much more I can take." "You've made it this far," Tommy said softly, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We're all in this together. We keep moving forward, no matter what." The young man nodded, though it was clear that the weight of the situation was breaking him. Tommy couldn't blame him, no one was immune to the pressure of survival in a world this broken. Rachel walked over to Tommy, her voice low. "We need a plan. We can't stay here long, and we can't fight our way through the Horde. What's the next move?" Tommy thought quickly, scanning the room for any possible options. There were no windows, and the door was sealed tight. The only way out was the narrow tunnel at the back of the room, but it led into the heart of the infected zone. It was a last resort, a dangerous gamble that could cost them everything. But it was their only choice. "We go through the tunnel," Tommy said, his voice unwavering. "It's risky, but it's our only chance." The survivors looked at each other, uncertainty on their faces. But they had no other choice. Tommy gave one final look at the door, knowing that the zombies were on the other side, only moments away from breaking through. They had to move, and they had to move fast. "We leave now," he said, his voice resolute. "We survive. We fight another day. Would you like to continue with part 7? The sound of the zombies pounding on the steel door echoed in the small, dimly lit room. Tommy's heart raced as he moved toward the narrow tunnel at the back, his hand resting on the cold metal of the door handle. Time was slipping away like sand through his fingers, and the air was thick with tension. He turned to the survivors, who were anxiously waiting behind him. "Stay close," Tommy said, his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "We're going through this tunnel, and we're sticking together. No one gets left behind." Rachel gave him a sharp nod. Her expression was grim, but her eyes burned with determination. The survivors were terrified, but she knew they had no choice. If they didn't move now, they would be trapped, surrounded by the relentless swarm of undead that was closing in fast. Tommy stepped toward the tunnel, pushing aside a piece of debris that had once been part of a shelf. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it offered their only hope of escape. It led deeper into the facility, winding through long-forgotten corridors, most of which were abandoned long before the outbreak. But it was better than waiting here to be overrun. As Tommy entered the tunnel, he motioned for the others to follow. One by one, the survivors filed into the narrow passage, their faces tense with fear and exhaustion. The young man Tommy had spoken to earlier was the last to enter, his steps shaky but determined. The tunnel smelled of stale air and damp earth, the walls lined with old pipes and the distant hum of machinery. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, but it was a nightmare they could survive if they kept moving. Tommy led the way, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. Rachel followed close behind, watching their rear. The survivors moved silently, their breathing heavy, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the dark. For a while, the only noise was the occasional creak of the tunnel's metal framework, but as they moved deeper, a new sound reached their ears, distant, but unmistakable. It was the faint sound of groaning, of slow, dragging footsteps that seemed to echo through the very walls of the tunnel. Tommy's pulse quickened. He motioned for everyone to stop. "Stay quiet," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "We don't know if they're ahead or behind us, but we need to be ready." The survivors froze, their bodies tense with fear. Tommy strained his ears, listening to the eerie sound. It was definitely there, groaning, moving. It was hard to tell if the zombies had already found their way into the tunnels or if it was just the sound of the infected roaming the facility above. "Is it safe?" the young man asked, his voice trembling. "Are we going to make it?" Tommy didn't have a clear answer. The truth was, they were in uncharted territory. No one knew where this tunnel led, and no one knew how far the zombies had infiltrated the underground sections. All he could do was lead them forward and hope for the best. "We're going to make it," Tommy said, his voice low and steady. "We have to." The group continued moving forward, but every step seemed to take them further into the unknown. The walls of the tunnel grew tighter, the air heavier, until it felt like they were being suffocated by the dark. And yet, despite the fear that gripped their hearts, they couldn't stop. There was no other option. Suddenly, there was a loud screeching sound, and the survivors jumped in unison, their eyes wide with panic. The walls of the tunnel seemed to vibrate, and then there was a thudding noise, louder and closer this time. Tommy spun around, his rifle up in an instant. "Get ready," he shouted. "Prepare for an attack." The survivors scrambled, taking cover against the tunnel's narrow walls, trying to steady their breaths and their nerves. Rachel crouched beside Tommy, her hand on her weapon. "What do you think it is?" she asked quietly, her face etched with concern. "I don't know," Tommy replied, his voice taut with tension. "But we're about to find out." The thudding grew louder, and then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead of them. It was a lone zombie, its flesh hanging off its bones in ragged strips, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Hold your fire," Tommy hissed, trying to keep the survivors calm. "One's not a problem, but we need to stay quiet." The zombie wandered past them, its movements slow and erratic. It groaned loudly, swaying from side to side as it dragged its feet. For a moment, the survivors dared to breathe, their bodies rigid as the creature passed within arm's reach. But the tunnel was long, and the sound of the zombies groaning only seemed to multiply as the moments dragged on. Tommy's instincts were on edge. There were more of them ahead, maybe many more. The darkness was swallowing them whole, and each step seemed to bring them closer to an unknown end. As they continued moving through the tunnel, a distant light flickered ahead. A break in the otherwise suffocating blackness. Tommy's eyes narrowed in the direction of the light. It was faint, but it was a sign of hope. "Keep moving," he ordered, urgency creeping into his voice. "We're close." The survivors picked up their pace, their feet scraping against the tunnel floor as they moved toward the light. With every step, the groans and footsteps of the undead grew louder. It was clear they weren't alone in these tunnels, and the survivors could only hope that the light ahead was a way out. As they neared the light, Tommy's heart skipped a beat. They were close now, but so were the zombies. There was no time to hesitate. They had to make it. The light grew brighter, and then, just as the tunnel seemed to close in around them, Tommy reached the end of the passage. He didn't know what waited on the other side, but it was the only chance they had left. He stepped through the doorway, his rifle raised and ready. Would you like to continue with Part 8? The moment Tommy stepped through the doorway, he was met with a sharp gust of cold air. The tunnel ended in a small, dimly lit chamber. Dust motes floated in the faint beam of light coming from a broken ceiling vent, casting an eerie glow on the space. The room was old, neglected, abandoned long before the outbreak. Rusted machinery lined the walls, but there was something else that caught Tommy's attention, a small set of metal doors at the far end of the chamber. The survivors stumbled in behind him, their footsteps slow and cautious as they took in the room. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice low but filled with hope. "Is that our way out?" Tommy nodded, keeping his rifle raised as he slowly moved toward the doors. "It has to be. It's the only exit we've seen." He approached the metal doors, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. The door was locked, the mechanism old and stiff, but it wasn't impassable. Tommy pushed with all his strength, gritting his teeth as he forced the rusted door open, the screech of metal on metal echoing in the chamber. Behind him, the survivors stood still, holding their breath, as if they too could sense the danger that was closing in around them. The sound of groaning and dragging footsteps filtered through the tunnel behind them, and Tommy knew that the zombies were right on their tail. The narrow passageways couldn't hold them off much longer. With a final push, the door creaked open enough for them to squeeze through. Tommy turned, motioning for the survivors to move quickly. "Go," he shouted, urgency in his voice. "Get through the door, now." One by one, the survivors rushed toward the door, their feet pounding against the cold floor. The young man who had struggled with fear earlier was the last to move, his face pale with terror as he hesitated for a moment, looking back at the dark tunnel. "Come on," Rachel urged him, grabbing his arm. "You've got this." The young man nodded, his face set with resolve as he sprinted toward the exit, his fear now replaced by the adrenaline of survival. Tommy followed closely behind, always on alert, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The sound of the zombies grew louder, closer, but just as they reached the door, a loud crash echoed behind them. A group of undead had appeared at the entrance of the tunnel, their eyes glowing with hunger, their twisted forms reaching out toward the survivors. Tommy quickly slammed the door shut behind them, but there was no time to rest. The lock was old, and it didn't catch properly. The door shook violently as the zombies slammed into it, their growls growing louder with each impact. It wouldn't hold for long. "We need to move," Tommy shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The survivors were already running ahead, but the room they found themselves in was unfamiliar. The floor was uneven, with cracks and holes scattered across the space. The walls were lined with rusted, broken machinery, and debris was piled in heaps against the far wall. It was a factory of some kind, once a place of industry, now reduced to a crumbling shell. "Where do we go?" Rachel asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Is there another way out?" Tommy surveyed the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the zombies pushing against the door, their moans growing louder. He didn't have much time to think, but there had to be another exit. There was always a way. To the left, a narrow stairwell led upward, barely visible in the gloom. "Up there," Tommy said, pointing toward the stairs. "That's our way out." The survivors hesitated, fear in their eyes. The stairwell seemed dark and narrow, and the sound of the zombies outside was deafening, but it was their only choice. "Let's go," Tommy shouted, running toward the stairs with Rachel close behind. The survivors followed, their footsteps heavy in the silence that had descended. As they ascended the stairs, the sound of the zombies' frantic pounding against the door below grew distant. But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded toward something. It wasn't just the infected they were up against, it was the unknown. Every turn, every decision, felt like it was leading them deeper into a trap. The stairs creaked beneath their weight as they moved upward, the tension building with every step. At the top of the stairs, they found a door. Tommy didn't waste time checking it for traps. He had to be sure, had to be fast. His fingers trembled as he gripped the handle and pushed it open. On the other side, the world stretched out before them, bright sunlight, blue skies, and a landscape that seemed untouched by the nightmare they had left behind. The survivors stumbled out into the daylight, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the sun. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. But the relief was short-lived. The sight before them was not the safety they had imagined. Instead, they stood at the edge of a high cliff, the jagged rocks below a stark reminder of the danger that awaited them. The land beyond the cliff was barren, desolate, abandoned for years, perhaps longer. "We're not out yet," Tommy muttered, taking a step back. His heart sank. "There's nowhere to go." Rachel's face was grim as she surveyed the surroundings. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "We're trapped." Tommy didn't answer right away. He turned to face the survivors, his expression unwavering. There was fear in their eyes, but there was also determination. They had survived this long. They wouldn't stop now. "No," he said finally. "We're not trapped. We keep moving forward." And so, with no clear plan and only the strength of their resolve to guide them, they stepped into the unknown once more. The battle for survival was far from over. This concludes the 8-part story, Zombies at the Border, Defending the Edge of Dead America. Would you like assistance with anything else?